I had a meeting with Callow yesterday, and I actually got to test this before tonight, so this works. Um, so hello again. As we said, my name is Brian Barkley. I'm a battalion chief with Cal Fire, and I'm currently working in the land for the State Fire Marshal's office in their land use planning program. Okay. Tonight we want to talk a little bit about the fire hazard severity zone maps. Okay. We want to do an introduction about them. We want to talk a little bit about the history of the maps, some of the science that went into creating the maps, and then also the local requirements that will be required by your cities and counties. A little bit of background, okay? The maps are not new to California. After the Panorama Fire in the 1980s, this fire began in San Bernardino Mountains. It was pushed by Santa Ana winds, and it burned over 28,000 acres and destroyed 325 homes, and it caused 4 fatalities, okay? This led to the creation of Public Resource Code 4201, and this required CAL FIRE to map fire hazard severity zones in the SRA, or State Responsibility Area. Okay. Now we fast forward 11 years, and we had what was called the Tunnel Fire. It was also known as the Oakland Hills Fire. Up until that point, it was one of the most devastating fires in California. This fire destroyed over 1,520 structures, acres, and it destroyed over 2,900 structures. There were 25 fatalities, and this led to the passage of Assembly Bill 337. This was also known as the Bates Bill, and this bill required CAL FIRE, the director of CAL FIRE, to now map fire hazard severity zones in the LRA, or local responsibility areas. Okay. So we added this today. I apologize that it doesn't match the rest, but I felt it was really important to try to point out a timeline or show you a timeline. As we kind of talked about earlier, we talked about the maps being created in the 1980s for, the state lands. We talked about the passage of the Bates Bill, but it wasn't until 2007 when the model was actually created and it implemented the fire hazard severity zones in the LRA, which would be our old fire hazard severity zone maps. Now, since then, in 2017, we had the Tubbs Fire that burned 36,000 acres and it destroyed 5,643 structures, and there were 22 fatalities. Okay. And then in 2018, that was followed up by the Camp Fire, which burned 153,000 acres and destroyed 18,000 structures. Okay. And it resulted in 85 fatalities. This led the state legislators to pass additional bills. The first ones you can see here on the screen were AB 642 and SB 63, which required the CAL FIRE to now not only identify the very high fire hazard severity zones in the LRA, but we also had to identify the high and the moderate, just like we do on state lands. Okay, and then also we had the passage of AB 11, which required the local agencies now to adopt ordinances for all 3 zones. Okay. So why is this important? The fire hazard severity zones, as I stated, are in the government code, and it outlines our responsibility. As I spoke about AB 211 just a minute ago, this also changed state law, and it took the responsibility of the fire hazard severity zones away from the director of CAL FIRE, and it now moved it over to the Office of the State Fire Marshal. Now that's important. As you guys probably know, the director of CAL FIRE has authority over the SRA. The state fire marshal has authority over LRA, or local responsibility areas. Okay. It involved us to reclassify all 3 zones in the LRA, and it also asked us to identify the hazards so public officials can identify measures that will reduce the spread and the potential intensity of uncontrolled fires threatening to destroy resources, life, and property. Okay, so a little bit about the science. Okay, first, the advancements in scientific factors. For example, there were new local climate data and enhanced fire assessment modeling were used in the new maps. So in our meetings with local agencies, I usually tell everyone we were actually able to take 20 years worth of RAWS weather station data for in this case around San Diego. And that was able to be put into the computer, and the computer was able to predict or show what a fire behavior would be like in a 50-year time frame with no mitigation, worst case scenario. The second thing, with the legislation that we talked about earlier, the process changed. So we had to identify all 3 zones, which wasn't in the previous maps. Okay. And then, as I said earlier, these updates included improvements in technology, burn probabilities, fire environments, vegetation density, slope, localized fire weather, and we were able to put in a new firebrand production and transport model using localized wind data, which I spoke about just a minute ago. So what we want to talk about right now is hazard versus risk, okay? Hazard is based on a physical condition that creates the likelihood and expected fire behavior over 50 years without consideration of mitigation, such as home hardening, recent wildfires, or fuel management efforts, okay? Risk is the potential damage a fire can do to an area under existing conditions, accounting for mitigations such as fuel management, defensible space, and ignition-resistant construction, okay? So there's a difference between the hazard and the risk. In a lot of meetings, I like to refer to it as teaching a kid to ride a bike, okay? The kid is not the hazard. The bike is the hazard. And what are you going to do to protect your child from that hazard? That's where your knee pads, your helmets, things like that come into effect. So the CAL FIRE's goal is to assist the local agencies with enhancing life and property safety. We work closely with the building industry with various types of building codes and defensible space requirements. And the goal was to not impede development, but to make sure the development aligns with the hazards for that area. Okay. So this is a quick graph that we put together. Currently in the state of California, these are the requirements that you're required to do if you live in the SRA, from adopting the fire hazard severity zones to doing CEQA before a project. If it's a subdivision, they have to make certain findings that you have roads, water supply, signage, and green belts to protect those subdivisions. It requires in unincorporated areas for the counties to update their general plans, specifically their safety elements. These are the blueprints for development for the county. Obviously, the fire safe regulations, building codes, defensible space. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the hazard disclosures. When you sell a home in California now, if you're in a very high or high, you have to disclose that if there's been any home hardening done to that home. And then also if you're in compliance with defensible space. One last one on here, not to be confused with the Subdivision Map Act, is subdivision review. And the state fire marshal is required every 5 years to meet with cities and counties and identify any communities with 30 structures or more that does not have a secondary means of egress, and they need to do a survey and make recommendations to improve fire safety for those neighborhoods. So lastly, I want to go over some of the local agency requirements. So once the maps come out, the local agencies have 120 days to make 30 days to make the maps public, and 120 days to pass an ordinance. Once they've passed that ordinance, well, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Before they pass the ordinance, they have to provide the public the opportunity to make comment on the maps. And then once they provided the comment, they need to designate by ordinance the fire hazard severity zones for their local agency. After the adoption of the map, the cities and counties or fire districts have 30 days to then submit those ordinances to the State Board of Forestry and Fire Protection for record keeping. Okay.